Hello, I'm Steve Headland, Communications and Events Manager at the Global Aquaculture Alliance. So GAA announced recently that it's relaunching its Signature Goal Conference, featuring a hybrid experience with a series of virtual events leading up to an in-person event in Seattle. Now, this approach builds on the virtual event that GAA organized last October, featuring 10 sessions and about 15 hours of content over the course of 4 days. One of those 10 sessions was chaired by our very own Ian Schoen, Director of Market Development in Europe for GAA's Best Aquaculture Practices Third-Party Certification Program. The session was titled Big Names, Big Targets, the Business Case for Sustainability and Collaboration. Now, speakers included representatives of key players such as Tesco, Cargill, Hilton Seafood, Proterra Foundation, Ocean Harvest Technology, and Japan's Seafood Legacy. Now, Ian, I'd like to kick things off by looking back at last year and asking you, what were the main takeaways from your Goal 2020 session?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Steve. That's actually a tough question. It was a great session, and it was nearly 2 hours long, so I got to distill it into just a few minutes, right? But I think number one is that we have to speed up our pace of change. And to quote one of the panelists, 10-year adoption timeframes are simply no longer acceptable. And another takeaway would be that many of the sustainability targets that were spoken about are very simple to say. Zero waste to landfill, carbon reduction, no further land use change for food production. But seafood supply chains are very complex and can involve many different products, commodities that come from many different countries. So what leads on from that is that traceability and transparency are absolutely critical. So you can plan in the best way. And finally, to finish answering your question, the title of the session, very often big topics require collaboration to be successful when we're talking about such complexity.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Now, Ian, I mentioned in the introduction that we're trying to build upon what we discussed last year. Of course, a lot has transpired in the last few months. Later this year, you're chairing a session again, Goal 2021. So what one issue would you focus on in 2021 that, perhaps in retrospect didn't get as much consideration as you wish it had in 2020?
Look, what's important to understand is the way we put these sessions together. And it's by consulting our audience. And we ask what is important to their customers and their businesses. And we'll do the same this year. So it's not really for me to say what the focus should be, but I thought a couple of areas that were really interesting from the discussion last year was number one, revolving around the barriers that a new actor has to overcome to be successful in introducing a novel ingredient in aquaculture compound feeds. The risks they face in investing and how they have to convince not one, but several actors in the supply chain in terms of cost. And indeed, even how cost is measured was quite an interesting point. Direct cost versus indirect costs, such as environmental damage, and proving technical performance and customer experience. So that's one area. I think another area was, the importance of demonstrating success to lift a whole sector. And the example the panel used was feed in salmon, and comparing the focus and the advances in the sustainability of salmon feed in the North Atlantic versus the relative slow movement in feed for perhaps other farm species in different parts of the world. And I suspect if we ask our audience this year, that will be a key topic. And indeed, there are some new initiatives exactly in this area which have started this year. So yeah, I think those two are I'd like to draw upon.
Okay. Well, finally, Ian, you had a pretty distinguished panel of speakers, and they spoke openly about the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. You So you singled out one series of comments that resonated with yourself as well as with our audience. Can you please cue it up? What are we about to watch?
Yeah, well, we're going to have a short clip from Anna Terrell's presentation, who very succinctly describes, and this is Anna from Tesco, sorry, I should say, she very succinctly describes some of the critical areas that the food industry has to change and warns us of the consequences if we don't.
Mhm. Perfect. All right. Thank you, Ian. Let's play the clip.
Our planet is at a critical juncture, with its future laying in the hands of humankind. Following decades of overproduction and consumption, with little consideration to the careful balance that nature has created, we have reached a tipping point. If we choose to ignore it, there will be no course correcting, no coming back to what we once had, only damage control. As a food industry, it's therefore imperative that we deliver healthy, sustainable and accessible food to our growing global population. And in so doing, we must tackle systemic issues such as food waste, biodiversity loss, ecosystem degradation and inequality.